Hello and welcome to Of Significance, the podcast about what's relevant, what's important, and what's meaningful. It's where we address whether the numbers and analytics we see daily are incredibly useful or nearly insignificant. I'm your every person host, Brent Buckwright, here with Dr. Nathan Woods and Dr. Steve Bronars, experienced experts who've been analyzing big data since before it was big. Nathan, Steve, what's on tap for today?
All right, thanks, Brent. We thought we'd chat a little bit today about a topic that comes up every so often, involving efforts that companies undertake to develop external benchmarks, from outside the company to evaluate whether the demographics of a company's hiring line up with the demographic profile of the labor market.
Yes, and usually the kind of external benchmarks that are available are coming from the U.S. Census Bureau or some other government agency, and the accuracy of the benchmark that's being used really depends on a number of factors that we're going to be talking about here. Sometimes these benchmarks are not going to be so accurate, and that's why we think that sometimes they miss the mark.
Well, okay, so the idea is I'm a well-intentioned employer who wants to make sure they're doing a good job of making sure I don't over or under select any particular protected group, like people over 40 versus people under 40. But there's a problem that I can't just use my own internal data to try and evaluate if I'm doing something right. I got to look somewhere else to confirm. What's the standard by which I'm confirming? What do I need to do to make sure I'm getting things right?
Well, you mentioned a couple of things. The first, just to be clear, you could use your internal data and you should use your internal data, but in some cases you may not have it. So you mentioned age as a protected group that you might be interested in looking at. Most of the time, the applicant data is not going to ask somebody's birth date or their age. And so you won't have that information. You've got that information, obviously, for the people that you've hired, but you don't have it for the people that have applied. So even if you were going to use your internal data, it wouldn't be perfect if you're looking at an age-protected group. The second reason, just before getting to your other question, that you'd look outside your applicant data is to have a sense for whether or not the applicants that you're attracting as a firm in your local area actually look like the labor market from which they come, from which you're trying to work in. So for both those reasons, you might be looking at these external data sources.
I think the other issue is that government agencies are monitoring, especially if you're a larger company, the hiring of a company's workforce. And that's going to be the EEOC and also the Office of Federal Contract Compliance Programs, which if you're a federal contractor, you have an affirmative action plan and you report to them. And you're going to be turning over information about the demographic characteristics of your workforce, not so much age, but the other race and ethnicity and gender groups. And you would like to know how your company looks relative to the benchmarks that these government agencies are going to be comparing you to, whether it's through the EEO1 reports or what we're going to be talking about more today, which is the census data. That's just a census of the overall U.S. population that they might compare your workforce to.
Well, in that case, if I'm comparing myself to the census data to make sure everything's on track, how do I actually make a benchmark? Where can that go wrong?
Well, I think it can go wrong in a number of different ways. The first thing to know is that the EEOC will be comparing you in terms of the data that you have to the census data from a thing called the American Community Survey, which is a 5% sample of the U.S., and they will be basing it probably on the occupation that you're hiring into and the metro area that you're in. But if you recruit nationally, they would look at a national labor market. And so one of the issues is what's really the labor market that you're talking about? Are you recruiting locally or nationally? What are the characteristics of the workers that you're trying to recruit? And one of the things that we would say you might want to do is kind of build your own external benchmark based on the same type of data that they would be using at the EEOC. And so you'd look at occupation, you'd look at whether there's some educational requirements, and try to tailor the benchmark more to the workforce that you have. But even with that, there are going to be some potential problems.
Yeah. So each of those things, whether it's geography, the industry that you're working in, the occupations, education, salary bands might come into it. And on any of those, uh, if you don't get it quite right, and if the workers that are available and interested in working for your company are distributed differently across the geographies, industries, occupations, and so on, you can get it really wrong.
I mean, thinking about older workers versus younger workers. So I look at the right industries, I look at the right locations. Obviously, there's always, margins of error in any data collection we do, but is that not like what else am I missing that I should be thinking about in order to build an appropriate benchmark?
Right. So at a minimum, you need to take into account all of that. But the even still, I think we in our experience think that that's not quite sufficient. And so the reason why is that even under the best possible, most refined approach to selecting on those occupations and industries and geographies that are correct for your company, your firm, the data can't tell us who in that group that you've identified in the census data is actually qualified and interested and available to change jobs to work at your firm and not some other firm.
Like some industries might have people who are willing to jump around more. Others might just be newer entirely. Like if I was looking at tech, say, it's just not as populated, perhaps as much with certain demographics of different populations. What else? What are factors that like change industry to industry that you guys would think are more important to, kind of keep in mind?
Well, I think that the key here is that the external benchmarks are snapshot pictures of who's currently in the industry, who's currently in the occupation, and that it changes over time. And if you're hiring at an entry-level job, you might be getting applicants who are straight out of school. They're not even in the job right yet. So you need to think about the appropriate benchmark, whatever the industry, whatever the occupation, for the workers that you're trying to recruit, that you're trying to hire. And they're going to typically tend to be younger. And that's why the age issue, I think, is such a difficult thing to really try to get the appropriate benchmark for, because when we look at the data, it's not obvious from the census data, but if you look at other data, people who move from one area to another, people who change jobs, they're systematically younger than the workforce that's just in place. So you're likely to be hiring workers who are younger on average than the existing workforce in that area. And it, like you said, in certain industries, certain occupations, tech, where there's been a lot of growth recently, it's an even younger workforce because so many of the workers that have come on board have come on recently.
So when we think about something like nationwide, different populations might be aging at different rates based off of new people coming in, birth rates, stuff like that. Is there any extent to which we have to think about nationwide how, more people being over 40, moving less or moving more, or any other kind of larger characteristics about any region might be affecting what you're sampling? I guess the question is trying to get at, it seems like it's really complicated to try and figure out what are the most important characteristics to look at when creating a benchmark without using a bunch of different outside data sources.
Yeah, well, and I look, it's complicated, and I think it all depends on what the company, where they're operating and what jobs they're trying to fill. But for sure, to the extent that the characteristics of the population that is available for hire is going to be different than as Steve was saying, the characteristics of that snapshot who are current incumbents in the job, you've got to take that into account when you're making your benchmark. Otherwise, the benchmark's not going to be helpful. It's going to overstate or understate, who's actually available and willing to take the job.
And when it comes to compliance with the Age Discrimination and Employment Act, the key age is age 40. People who are age 40 and above are age protected, and people who are under age 40 are not. So there are some jobs, there've been all sorts of inquiries and lawsuits on a bunch of different jobs about age discrimination hiring. If you look at a job like restaurant servers, 20% are age 40 and above overall, but among the people who just moved into the job, it's less than half that, only about 9 or 10%. If you look at a really hot job is software developers, and I know these numbers because I just gave a talk on this at a recent labor and employment law conference.
Hey, no need to brag.
But
we all give presentations places.
Right. I assumed you had those handy anyway.
Yeah.
I just don't remember all these numbers.
Why are they written on your hand?
But software developers, which is very growth job, been adding a lot of workers in that area for quite a while now. It's about 42% age 40 and above. But again, among the people that are just starting jobs, it's 23%. Again, about half that. So workers who are starting jobs tend to be much younger. And that's usually where the inquiries are going to be in terms of our applicant pool, in terms of our recent hires. How are we doing relative to the benchmarks? So I think in addition to the census data, you could look at data on that the education department puts out on recent graduates in certain fields, because it's very difficult, as Nathan has been saying, to find out who might be interested in the job that we're posting for. And if we just look at the general population of people already in the job, we know that's going to skew older, and therefore it's going to look like our application process and our hiring process is under hiring older workers, when that's probably not the case at all. It's probably the case that you're missing the mark in terms of the benchmark that you're using.
And it doesn't have to go for older workers. Kind of intuition in the data would tell you that it probably is, if you don't adjust it for people who have more recently demonstrated they're willing to leave their job, that you're going to have a higher benchmark for older workers than is actually available. But that's not necessarily going to be the case for other protected groups, race ethnic groups, women. And so depending on what the job is, what the company is, what part of the country you're in, a lot of circumstances, it can vary, but that benchmark, probably it's worth taking a look at how different it would be if you adjusted for this, more recent demonstration of changing jobs.
Right. In tech, like if you look at engineers, people who are graduating with engineering degrees, it's 25% women and 75% men. That's higher than it's ever been. And so that means if you're looking to hire relatively recent graduates or people who are in the workforce that relatively recently graduated with a degree in engineering, it should skew more towards women than if you looked at the overall population of all engineers, regardless of age, regardless of their cohort.
So in missing the mark, I am inappropriately assuming that the group of people in any particular population could be equally exchanged for one another, that all their preferences for selecting, going for jobs, trying to move locations, that I can't just group everyone together and treat them as if they're one-to-one. I guess, are there any solutions to this? Is there data that we can use to augment benchmarks and weight things better? Or are these more factors that we just need to keep in mind when we do a kind of analysis of hiring decisions?
Yeah, I don't think there's any solution is a very strong word. I don't think there are any solutions that are perfect. I think there are adjustments that you can make in the data. I think being aware of this possibility that relatively more straightforward benchmarking approach may be wildly different from what is actually possible out there, and do the diagnostics, figure out how close or how far away it is. If it's pretty close, maybe it's not a big deal. If it's wildly different, then maybe you should be thinking about using an approach that takes into account the adjustment the way we've kind of talked about. As far as, a more perfect solution might be one where these questions are asked directly in a more robust way to survey respondents, but I don't think that data is available to us, and unless the census is listening in, it probably won't be.
Okay. Well, I think we're out of time, which means that we're going to go to Steve's corner, where Steve can exposit on any of the things he hasn't yet been able to say. Steve, what do you got?
Well, I think one of the things that we'll talk about at some point in the future is the fact that even if you're recruiting nationally, and the tendency might be to think that you should look at a national labor market benchmark. But depending on where you're recruiting for the job, assuming people aren't working remotely and they can just work from wherever they live right now, people have to be interested also in moving to your city, to that part of the country that you're in. And migration patterns are such that people might move back to a place where they lived before, where they grew up, where they went to school. And so, again, it's not clear, and we'll talk about that more, I think, in another episode, that you're going to get a representative sample of the entire U.S. who'd be willing to relocate to your city for the job that you're hiring for.
Well, that's been this episode of Significance. This episode's been brought to you by Edgeworth Economics, a leader in economic consulting, and with the help of our producers, Kimberly Krewald, Ryan Deal, and Brian McLemara of Brand Ready Media, with music by Armwell Lang. Thanks for listening, StatPack, and always remember to check your assumptions.